Hello, class. Thank you for joining me for our Language Arts Civil War Literature lesson. We are currently reading the story of the Gettysburg Address by Kenneth Richards. This is part two of our two-part video reading. Okay? So before I begin reading, I just want to let you know I'm going to read a tiny bit of a section of the book that we read yesterday, just to transition into what we are going to read today. Okay. When the work was finished, the townspeople were very pleased. The brave men who had died now had an honorable resting place. "We must dedicate the cemetery," Mr. Wills said. "I will ask important people to speak at the ceremony." A few days later in Washington, D.C., President Lincoln received a letter from Mr. Wills. He asked the president to come to Gettysburg and make a speech at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery. President Lincoln was a very busy man. The war was still going on, and many matters needed his close personal attention. It was very difficult for him to get away from Washington, even for a little while. But he knew, perhaps more than anyone, how important the Battle of Gettysburg had been. He wrote Mr. Wills that somehow he would find the time to come to Gettysburg. The night before he was to leave Washington for the dedication, President Lincoln began working on his speech. He knew that the main speaker at the ceremony would be Mr. Edward Everett of Massachusetts, the most famous orator in America. He realized that Mr. Everett would talk for a long time and that there would be other speakers, so Lincoln decided to make his speech very short. Because he was aware of the fact that newspapers all over the country would print his speech, he wanted it to be perfect. He worked for hours writing and rewriting the sentences. When he had finished the first draft, he went to bed. Early the next morning the president boarded the special train that was to carry him and the other dignitaries to Gettysburg. As the countryside of Maryland and Pennsylvania rolled past his window, Lincoln thought of the war. He knew that peace would eventually come to the land and that the Union would remain strong and undivided because of the efforts of brave men like those buried at Gettysburg. "My speech does not express how deeply I feel about these men," he thought. "I must rewrite it. I want people everywhere to understand what freedom means to us and how much we owe to the brave soldiers who died at Gettysburg." The train arrived in the small town just as the sun was setting. A carriage drove Mr. Lincoln to the home of Mr. Wills, where he was to spend the night. Mr. Everett was a guest in the house also. After dinner the president went to his room to work on his speech. During the evening a group of people came to sing for the president beneath his window. Lincoln opened the window to wave, and then he spoke a few words to the crowd that had gathered. When they left, he returned to his work. It was past midnight before the speech was finished. Lincoln had written it on 2 pieces of lined paper. There were only 268 words. "It is what I would call a short speech," he said. Then he went to bed. At 11 o'clock the next morning, November 19th, 1863, the parade to the cemetery began. Congressmen, generals, and governors were in the procession, and there were brass bands and military units. Mr. Lincoln rode on a handsome horse. He wore a black suit, white gloves, and his tall black stovepipe hat. Nearly every citizen of Gettysburg had come to see the parade and hear the speeches. The shops and the schools in the town were closed, and thousands of people lined the streets to watch the procession pass. Billy and Jenny Gibbs stood in the midst of the crowd in front of their father's store. They were very excited because their father was going to take them to see and hear the president. The parade wound slowly out of the town and up the road leading to the cemetery. Most of the people had never seen the president before. They cheered as he passed, and he waved his hand or nodded his head. Billy and Jenny waved too, and Jenny was sure that Mr. Lincoln waved back to her. Then Billy, Jenny, and their father joined the crowd, following the procession to the ridge. At last the parade reached the cemetery. A platform had been built for the speakers and decorated with red, white, and blue bunting. President Lincoln climbed the steps to the platform and took his seat in the front row. In the distance he could see the great battlefield. The sounds of fighting were gone now, and autumn leaves covered the ground. There was peace at Gettysburg. A tear came to Lincoln's eye as he remembered the men who had fought and died here only 4 months before. Holding tightly to his children's hands, Mr. Gibbs pushed forward through the crowd until the three of them stood directly in front of the speaker's platform. Now they would be able to see and hear everything clearly. A band played to open the ceremony. When the music ended, the crowd grew silent as a minister said a prayer. Following the prayer, the United States Marine Band played, and then, one after another, speakers rose from their seats to address the crowd. They told the people that the cemetery was a grand achievement and that the nation was very proud of the citizens of Gettysburg. Soon it was time for Mr. Everett to speak. Mr. Everett had a powerful voice, and even those farthest from the platform could hear his words. He spoke for nearly 2 hours. When he was finished, a choir sang a hymn that had been written especially for the occasion. At last, the President was introduced. Lincoln rose slowly from his chair and put on his steel-rimmed glasses. Billy and Jenny looked up at his kindly but careworn face. When the crowd had grown silent, the President began to read from the 2 handwritten pages he held in his hand. "407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those here gave their lives that the nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." The people applauded when the President's speech was finished. Then everyone joined in singing a hymn. A final prayer was said, and the ceremony ended. Mr. Lincoln mounted his horse, and he and the other dignitaries rode down the hill to the town. As Billy and Jenny walked slowly homeward with their father, they wondered about the President's speech. "What did President Lincoln mean when he said 407 years ago?" asked Billy. "Well," replied his father, "a score of years would be 20, so 407 would be 87 years. Can you tell me what that year is?" Billy closed his eyes for a minute as he tried to do the arithmetic in his head. Jenny, who was 2 years older, found the answer first. "The year was 1776, she said triumphantly. "That was the year the Declaration of Independence was written." "That's right," said Mr. Gibbs. "It was that year that our nation was born, or as Mr. Lincoln put it, brought forth upon this continent. Who do you suppose the President was referring to when he said our fathers?" "I know," answered Billy. "He meant George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and all the other men who helped to found our country. But what did Mr. Lincoln mean when he said this war was testing our nation?" "When our nation was born," Mr. Gibbs explained, "the fathers of our country created a new kind of government. It was founded on the belief that all men have an equal right to liberty and freedom. As Mr. Lincoln said, we have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. In other words, we govern ourselves by free elections. Many people thought that our kind of government would not last very long. The Union must win this war if we are to prove that a nation founded on this principle can last." Turning a corner, they saw the little white house in which they lived. Mr. Gibbs had repaired the fence that had been smashed by army wagons during the battle, but there were still holes in the barn where cannon balls had struck. "I liked what Mr. Lincoln said about the soldiers," Jenny said. "I'm glad that he and the other important people came to dedicate the cemetery." "Yes," answered Mr. Gibbs, "everyone did their best to honor the soldiers today. But as Lincoln said, we must not forget the reasons why they fought and died here. They gave their lives to save our government and our way of life. We must work even harder now for the same cause. Unless the Union wins the war, they will have died for nothing." As they turned into their gate, Billy said, "President Lincoln said that the world won't remember his speech, but I'll never forget it." "The President was not talking just to the people who were at the cemetery," Mr. Gibbs replied. "His speech will be printed in many newspapers tomorrow, so he was really speaking to the nation and to the world. But I think he also had in mind all the generations of Americans to come." "The Civil War will end some day, and the Union will be saved," said Mr. Gibbs confidently. "But there will be other troubles for America in the years ahead. Each time our nation is threatened, Americans will remember Lincoln's words." The next day, newspapers around the country printed President Lincoln's address. Most praised what he had said, but there were some newspapers that had never liked Lincoln and were opposed to his presidency. They never approved of anything he said and printed unfavorable comments about the speech. In Washington, the president read the newspaper reports. "The people are disappointed," he said. He still did not believe that his speech was very good. To his surprise, he received an admiring letter from Mr. Everett. The letter said, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." Lincoln replied in his usual modest way. He wrote, "In our respective parts, you could not have been excused to make a short address, or I a long one. I am pleased to know that in your judgment the little I did say was not entirely a failure." President Lincoln wrote 3 more revisions of his address. These copies, along with his 2 original drafts, are still in existence today. The first draft, written in Washington, and the second, written at the Wills home in Gettysburg, are on display at the Library of Congress. One of the copies, written by Lincoln after his return to Washington, is owned by Cornell University. Another is in the Illinois State Historical Society Library, and the third is in the Lincoln Room of the White House. The Gettysburg Address has become the most famous speech in our history. Lincoln's words have as much meaning today as they had for the people who listened to them that day at Gettysburg. The day after the dedication, a Chicago newspaper wrote, "The dedicatory remarks of President Lincoln will live among the annals of men." And so they have. All right. That's the end of our book for today. Make a great day, everyone.